Hello everyone, I'm here to read with you a book called The Gift. It's by Kristine L. Franklin and the illustrations are by Barbara Lavalle. In a place by the sea, where the winters are wet and the summers are cool and tall trees stand like guards along the shoreline, there lived a boy named Jimmy Joe. When he wasn't in school, Jimmy Joe liked to throw sticks for his dog, climb trees, and chase seagulls. But like his grandfather and his father and all the fathers before him, more than anything else, Jimmy Joe loved to fish. One day, Fishwoman said to Jimmy Joe, "Let's go for a boat ride, eyes like blackberries." Fishwoman was old and wise. She never used anyone's real name. "Can we fish?" asked Jimmy Joe. "Of course," said Fishwoman. "Why else would we go?" Jimmy Joe ran home to ask his mother. "Fishwoman knows everything about the sea, doesn't she?" asked Jimmy Joe. His mother nodded and tugged a sweater on over his head. "She knows the weather, the tides, and where to fish, and what to take for bait, right?" Jimmy Joe's mother nodded again and pulled a wool hat down over his ears. Some people said that Fishwoman was a sea witch and that her spit could kill a dogfish. "She's not really a witch, is she?" Jimmy Joe asked his mother. Jimmy Joe's mother smiled, but "catch a few dozen" was all she said. Jimmy Joe promised his mother a bucket full of fish and hurried down to the beach. Fishwoman lived in a tumble-down shack right on the beach. Once it had been white. Now it was a soft color of a rain cloud. In front of the house, just below the timber bulkhead, Fishwoman was pouring gasoline into an outboard motor. The sharp smell of the gasoline mixed with the salty sea. It was a good smell, a fishing smell. "Climb aboard," said Fishwoman. Jimmy Joe took his seat on the bow. Fishwoman then heaved the little boat into deep water and hopped aboard nimbly as a squirrel. The outboard motor started with a roar. "What are we after?" shouted Jimmy Joe. "What are you after?" shouted the Fishwoman. Jimmy Joe thought of the cod and sole and sea perch he would bring to his mother. "Stewfish!" he yelled. "I know something better than stewfish," Fishwoman hollered above the sound of the motor. "Salmon?" asked Jimmy Joe. Fishwoman headed the boat toward Chinook Point. "I'm going to catch a big salmon!" yelled Jimmy Joe. "I know something even better than salmon," shouted Fishwoman. She grinned until her eyes nearly disappeared. Jimmy Joe peeked over the side of the boat into the green water to see if the salmon were running. Fishwoman laughed. "Do you think they swim up here where you can see them?" Jimmy Joe smiled and shook his head. He didn't know what salmon did when they were running. He only wanted to catch one and take it back home. When they got to Chinook Point, Fishwoman cut the motor. Jimmy Joe dropped the anchor overboard. He was careful not to let the nylon rope burn his hands as it whizzed into the deep. The water made a thick, salty plop as Jimmy Joe's bait and weights disappeared into the bay. "If you hook a salmon," said Fishwoman as she tossed her rig into the water, "let me know. You'll need help." Jimmy Joe was sure he wouldn't need any help. For a long time, nothing happened. The fish weren't biting, not even a nibble. The water was flat and slick and gray. Jimmy Joe grew tired of sitting. A big fish hit just as the wet fog rolled in. Oh, yep. Jimmy Joe knocked over the bait bucket with his foot. The herring flipped about in the bottom of the boat. The water soaked Jimmy Joe's shoes. Suddenly, Jimmy Joe was slipping and falling. Fishwoman grabbed him around the middle. One bony fist clamped around the fishing rod. "It's a salmon, eyes like blackberries," she whispered. "Keep your rod in the air." Jimmy Joe's heart flipped and flopped like the big fish. "Hang on," yelled Fishwoman. "He'll try to run under the boat. Keep the tip up." Jimmy Joe cranked and slackened and pulled. Together, they held on tight. His arms and back began to ache, but he didn't let go. Finally, they brought the tired salmon into the boat. It was enormous. Jimmy Joe helped Fishwoman lift the salmon into some crushed ice. The fish was bigger than he could reach with his own 2 arms spread wide. Its skin glittered silver and gold like a pirate's treasure. None of Jimmy Joe's friends had ever caught a Chinook. It was something to be proud of, but something was wrong. Jimmy Joe tried to be happy. He imagined the surprise on his mother's face when he brought home such a huge fish. But looking at the beautiful dead fish made Jimmy Joe feel cold inside. Then, through the thickening fog, Jimmy Joe heard a sound. It was a long way away, a long way off. But soon the sound got louder and closer. All at once, Jimmy Joe saw 9 glossy black backs and sharp dorsal fins in the water. Went the sound, exhaled through the blowholes, size of his fist. And then he heard the fishwoman whisper, "Welcome." One whale moved in close. The fin on its back stood as tall as Jimmy Joe. Jimmy Joe shivered. His heart rattled and thumped, but he wanted to see the whale. He inched toward the edge of the boat. Beside him in the water was the largest animal he had ever seen. "What do they want?" asked Jimmy Joe in a voice that quivered like a jellyfish. "They want the same thing you do, food." Jimmy Joe's eyes opened wide and Fishwoman grinned. "Salmon, boy. They're hunting salmon. The wolves of the sea don't waste their time on little boys and tough old women." As if it had heard her words, the whale rolled playfully onto one side. Jimmy Joe saw its bright white underbelly and its huge mouth curled up in a permanent smile. It was almost close enough to touch. The whale looked carefully at Jimmy Joe's face. It waved one flipper in the air and then splash, smacked it down hard on the water. The whale blew a spray of fishy breath in Jimmy Joe's face. Then the whale rolled over and looked at Jimmy Joe straight in the eye. This time, its grin was for Jimmy Joe. Fishwoman laughed out loud. Then, sudden noise startled the whale. It slipped below the surface and moved away. "Come back!" yelled Jimmy Joe. But the whale had disappeared. Jimmy Joe looked at Fishwoman. Then he looked at the salmon. Jimmy Joe tried to lift the salmon himself, but it was heavy and slick. Fishwoman helped him. Together, they slipped the big fish into the sea. Suddenly, the whale sped back toward the boat. With one monstrous gulp, it grabbed the fish and dove out of sight. The little boat danced and jumped in its wake. Jimmy Joe heard in the distance, but he couldn't see through the fog. He looked for the other whales, but they were gone. "Bring them back!" cried Jimmy Joe, looking at Fishwoman. "Me?" Fishwoman asked with a surprised look. She shook her head. "When the wolves of the sea choose to show themselves, it's a gift. It's better than cod or sole or sea perch," whispered Jimmy Joe. "It's better than catching a salmon." "I'm glad you think so, eyes like blackberries," said Fishwoman. She patted Jimmy Joe's hand and grinned so hard her eyes nearly disappeared. "And now," she said, "let's go catch that bucket of stew fish." The end. Thanks for reading The Gift with me, and I'll see you next time.